New Jersey woman is found brutally murdered by the side of the road. Investigators must make their case from a few bite marks left on the victim's body. A sadistic predator targets young women in a quiet Canadian community. As police struggle to track him down, the killer threatens more victims. Indiana firefighters discover a woman murdered in her bed. But will dental impressions be enough to convict her killer? Some murderers are compelled to leave a very personal mark on their victims. But with the help of forensic odontologists, police can use those marks to capture those who kill with a deadly smile. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. Just after midnight on August 12, 1994, police in Woodbridge, New Jersey were dispatched to a remote area just off Route 1. A battered, semi-nude woman, identified as 25-year-old Melissa Padilla, had been found murdered, lying inside a concrete pipe. Crime technicians began processing the area for clues. They collected several recently purchased grocery items scattered near the body. They also recovered a blood-stained dollar bill and nearby several cigarette butts, which investigators hoped would yield valuable DNA evidence. The victim's discarded shorts, stained with blood, were found nearby. Inside one of the pockets was a store receipt for several grocery items, time-stamped 11:29 p.m.
Hector, this is Sergeant.
While evidence technicians continued processing the scene, Melissa's boyfriend, Hector Gonzalez, who had found her body, was brought in for questioning. He couldn't imagine anyone who would want to hurt Melissa, a dedicated mother of 4. Hector said that after putting the kids to bed around 11 p.m., Melissa said she wanted to go to a nearby convenience store to pick up a few things. Hector agreed to watch the kids. She said she would be back within a half hour.
Thank you.
When she hadn't returned more than an hour later, he became concerned and asked a friend to help look for her. That's when they found Melissa's battered body along Route 1, the path she normally took to go to the store. Hector later agreed to take a polygraph examination. Test results indicated he had nothing to do with Melissa's murder. Though police had no obvious suspects, the motive behind the murder seemed clear. Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office Lieutenant Lawrence Nagel worked the case.
The woman that was found at the scene was found naked from the waist down. It appeared there was severe trauma to her face area. Initial impressions were that it appeared to be a sexual type of situation.
At autopsy, the medical examiner concluded that Melissa Padilla had died of manual strangulation. Her face had been viciously beaten. Though it was clear she had been sexually assaulted, no biological evidence was recovered. More disturbing was the presence of small contusions on the victim's body. The ones found on Melissa's chin appeared to be bite marks. Knowing the bite marks would be crucial in linking a suspect to the crime, an identification officer with the Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office precisely photographed them to scale, using standards developed by the American Board of Forensic Odontologists. For the bite mark evidence to be useful, investigators had to identify a suspect. Trying to retrace Melissa's movements, investigators retrieved the security camera videotape from the store Melissa had been to just before her death. Melissa was clearly visible, purchasing the items found near her body. The amount of change she was seen receiving was the same amount found in her pocket. But no one who appeared in the video looked suspicious. Analysis of the items recovered from the crime scene had little else to offer. Though DNA was found on the cigarette butts, investigators had no way to determine who had left them there or when. And all of the blood that was collected belonged to Melissa. A meticulous search for any suspect fingerprints turned up nothing. Despite the lack of clues to the killer's identity, the bite marks he left behind gave investigators a glimpse into his violent mind. Assistant Prosecutor Thomas Capsack of the Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office worked the case.
The nature of the crime suggested anger. The victim was really brutalized. There had to be a lot of pain involved, and we eventually concluded that the bite mark on the chin occurred while he was looking into her eyes while he was causing pain.
Police began focusing their attention on sex offenders known to be living in the area. A state prison facility housing such offenders was located just a few miles from the crime scene. And several inmates had recently been released. Investigators tracked each one of them down. All denied knowledge of Melissa Padilla's murder. And all were eventually cleared by polygraph examinations. Investigators scoured dozens of homicide cases looking for one with a similar MO. But despite their efforts, 8 months passed with no progress in the investigation of Melissa Padilla's murder. But in April 1995, investigators received a call from the Maine State Police. Authorities there were requesting background information on a Woodbridge, New Jersey resident, 31-year-old Stephen Fortin, who was in their custody for sexually assaulting a female Maine State Trooper. For Lieutenant Nagel, the details of the assault sounded eerily familiar.
It was revealed during a conversation with the Maine State Police that the trooper during the assault by Stephen Fortin was bitten in the same immediate areas that Melissa Padilla was bitten on.
Hoping this was the break they had been waiting for, investigators traveled to Maine to speak with the trooper, who was still recovering in the hospital. Investigators immediately noticed that the trooper had sustained bite marks on her chin, the same spot where Melissa Padilla had been bitten. The off-duty trooper said she saw a car parked on the side of the road, facing oncoming traffic.
Open the window!
Concerned, she pulled over.
You having trouble with your car tonight?
The driver claimed to be having mechanical problems,
Okay, I need you to
but
step
the
out of
trooper
car
noticed a
shop.
strong alcohol smell.
Okay, stay right there, okay? Don't move. Don't move. Okay.
She administered a breathalyzer test, which confirmed that the man was intoxicated. As the trooper radioed into the station for backup, the man suddenly attacked her from behind and knocked her unconscious. When she came to, she was in the passenger seat of her patrol car. She was in a great deal of pain and suddenly realized she had been sexually assaulted while unconscious. Believing the assailant was planning to kill her, the trooper jumped out of the car. The driver continued on. The next thing she remembered was waking up in the hospital. Her assailant, Stephen Fortin, was taken into custody less than an hour later. After examining and photographing the trooper's injuries, one thing became clear. The assault on the state trooper and the murder of Melissa Padilla bore the same ritualistic signature.
Ritual involves getting sexual gratification from the crime you commit. The signature in our case really was the ritual, and that is the beating to the eyes and the nose, the bite mark on the chin.
Come over here and check
For
this
investigators, the similar MO of the two assaults had to be more than just a coincidence. New Jersey police went to the jail in Kennebec County, Maine, to question Fortin about the Melissa Padilla homicide. Though Fortin admitted to living in Woodbridge, New Jersey at the time, he insisted he didn't know anyone named Melissa Padilla and denied any knowledge of her murder. He also denied ever being in the area along Route 1, where Melissa's body was found. But he didn't deny his involvement in the assault on the female trooper, though he claimed he had acted in self-defense. Investigators collected hair and blood samples to compare to evidence recovered from the Melissa Padilla crime scene. Though investigators finally had a strong suspect in the young woman's homicide, they were still a long way from proving that Stephen Fortin was her killer. With only bite mark evidence to work with, police in Woodbridge, New Jersey struggled to solve the brutal murder of Melissa Padilla, a 25-year-old mother of 4.
Why don't you move to Maine?
After several months with no leads, police learned of a similar assault more than 300 miles away in Maine. And the suspect in that case, Stephen Fortin, had recently moved there from Woodbridge. While waiting for DNA analysis, New Jersey authorities interviewed Fortin's friends and associates. They located an ex-girlfriend who still lived in Woodbridge. She had plenty to say about Steve Fortin. She said their turbulent 4-month relationship suddenly came to a violent halt after Fortin assaulted her during an argument they had while taking a walk along Route 1. She added that after their fight, Fortin returned to apologize. The girlfriend noticed cuts and scratches on Fortin's face and hands. Fortin explained that he feared she had called the police, and he fled through the woods to avoid them. She believed the incident had taken place on August 12th. Not only was that the night Melissa was murdered, but the girlfriend had put Fortin on Route 1, an area he previously claimed he had never been to. Though investigators were now convinced that Fortin was Melissa Padilla's killer, DNA analysis on the cigarette butt found near her body was inconclusive. Examiners analyzed all of the evidence found at the crime scene again, hoping something may have been overlooked. But nothing was found. For identification officer Jim O'Brien, it was clear that the bite marks would be the crucial link connecting Stephen Fortin to Melissa's murder.
The DNA results were inconclusive. We had no hairs or fibers from Stephen Fortin found on the victim's body, and I never developed any fingerprints on any of the evidence that came back to anyone except the victim herself. Therefore, the photographs of the bite marks on the victim's body were very, very important in terms of physical evidence and in terms of putting Stephen Fortin at this crime scene.
In April 1995, Stephen Fortin was taken to the office of Dr. Brian Morin, a dentist in Waterville, Maine. To prove Fortin had made the bite marks on Melissa's body, investigators first needed models detailing every unique feature of his teeth. First, photographs of the suspect's teeth are taken using a millimeter ruler, so examiners can accurately determine the scale of the photos for later comparisons to pictures of the victim's injuries. Then, impressions of the upper and lower teeth are taken using a substance called dental stone, a material similar to plaster. After the molds are allowed to harden, Morin then grinds them down to remove excess material, allowing examiners to clearly see the unique features of the teeth. The molds of the suspect's teeth, in addition to life-size photographs of the bite mark injuries, are all examiners need to perform the analysis. Dr. Tom Richardson, a forensic odontologist in Portland, Maine, explains the process.
The molds of teeth are the casts. They are the likeness of the individual's teeth in size and in shape. The photos are from the individual or medium that was bitten, and they are life size as well. We take the casts, put an overlay, go up against the marks on the photo, and we either are going to have a match if the photos are good and the marks are there, or we're not going to.
Using a computer program, examiners demonstrated how the casts made of Stephen Fortin's teeth lined up perfectly with the bite marks on the victim's chin.
Photographs here.
The spacing between Fortin's teeth, the dimensions of the arches of his bite, and the unique details of his teeth were all consistent with the injuries on both victims. Detectives now had the physical proof they needed to charge Stephen Fortin with the murder of Melissa Padilla.
Very good.
Police believe that Stephen Fortin chanced upon Melissa as she returned from the convenience store. Still enraged by the argument with his girlfriend, Fortin brutally beat, bit, and sexually assaulted her before finally strangling her to death. In February 2001, he was sentenced to death in New Jersey for the murder and aggravated sexual assault of Melissa Padilla. He also pled guilty to charges stemming from the beating and sexual assault on the Maine state trooper. He received a maximum 20-year sentence. Stephen Fortin found gratification in a brutal ritual. But 3,000 miles away in Canada, in a quiet suburb of Vancouver, one killer took perverse satisfaction from taunting the detectives on his trail. Abbotsford, British Columbia, Canada, October 14, 1995. In the early morning hours, officers from the Abbotsford Police Department were dispatched to a hospital emergency room. There, they found 16-year-old Melissa Connor, still recovering from a brutal beating she sustained a few hours earlier. Melissa told investigators that she and a friend, Tracy Sawyer, were on their way to a party when a man wielding a baseball bat jumped out of the bushes and attacked them. During the struggle, Melissa was knocked unconscious. When she came to, Tracy and the assailant were nowhere in sight. Though her recollection of the attack was still a bit hazy, Melissa was certain she had never seen the man before. Investigators rushed to the scene of the assault to search for Tracy. But only one item found at the scene suggested that a struggle had taken place. A single hoop earring that belonged to the missing teenager. Inspector Rod Gale of the Abbotsford Police Department hoped a canvass of the neighborhood would yield information.
There were witnesses in the area of the crime scene, but the witnesses that we established there had only heard screams in the early hours of the morning, and no one had actually seen anything.
Okay.
Investigators feared that the 16-year-old Tracy Sawyer had been abducted, or worse. And with no suspects to pursue, they knew that time was working against them. A description of the missing teenager and details of the assault were distributed to all area law enforcement agencies. A few hours later, a man fishing along the Vedder River noticed something on the riverbank. As he moved closer to get a better look, he realized he had found a human body. Officers of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police who responded to the scene found that the young female victim had been savagely beaten and raped. Police scoured the shoreline for clues that could help them identify the young woman and her killer. But they found nothing. Still, officers of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police believed this was the missing Abbotsford girl. Sergeant Kevin McLeod.
The obvious connection to me to the Abbotsford case was the fact that Abbotsford had a missing girl and we had a dead girl. And this close vicinity of the two communities.
Dental records confirmed that the woman found at the Vedder River was Tracy Sawyer. The medical examiner confirmed that the young woman had been raped. He also noted massive blunt force trauma to her head. But that wasn't what killed her. The official cause of death was ruled a drowning. The only clues to the killer's identity were bite marks on the victim's torso. The impressions were carefully photographed and preserved as evidence. The photos were sent to the Bureau of Legal Dentistry Laboratory in Vancouver. There, Dr. David Sweet, a recognized expert in forensic odontology, examined the evidence. After studying the bite mark injuries, he realized there was the potential for additional evidence to be obtained.
A new technique was available for recovering saliva from a bite mark, and we could even determine if DNA was available from the saliva and then possibly match that back to the suspect when and if one was made available.
The theory behind the technique, referred to as double swabbing, is that saliva from the suspect's mouth is transferred into the bite marks left on the victim. As demonstrated here, Dr. Sweet first dampens a sterile swab with distilled water, then wipes it across the impressions, rehydrating any saliva cells in the bite marks. Then, he applies a second dry swab to the wounds, which will act as a sponge and collect the rehydrated cells that contain the suspect's DNA. Dr. Sweet performed the procedure on the teeth impressions found on Tracy Sawyer. And though she had been submerged in water for some time, he was confident the double swabbing technique would yield DNA evidence.
Despite the fact that the body had been in water, the saliva is sticky enough in order to remain there, and if you can use some methods to collect that evidence that's there, even in trace forms, you'll have enough to test and to analyze.
The procedure was successful. Minute traces of the killer's DNA was collected. But for that evidence to be useful, investigators would now have to find a way to identify a suspect. A forensic odontologist had successfully extracted the killer's DNA from bite marks found on 16-year-old murder victim Tracy Sawyer. But for the evidence to be useful, police in Abbotsford, British Columbia, now had to identify a suspect. They turned to the victim's parents for information. The couple said that the last time they saw Tracy was shortly before the assault. She and her friend, Melissa Connor, were leaving for a party at a neighborhood friend's house. They promised not to be out too late. Tracy seemed upbeat and excited about the party.
that nice? You look so happy.
The couple couldn't think of a single person who would want to hurt their beautiful young daughter. In addition to releasing limited details of the investigation to the media, police also set up a tip line for potential witnesses to call with information. Soon after, a call came in. The man on the other end claimed to be Tracy's killer. He described in detail the bite mark found on the victim's body.
The only people that would know about it were the people at the autopsy, the doctors, the policemen attending the autopsy, and the immediate core team of the investigation. So it had to be the individual that had intimate knowledge of the crime scene to know about that bite mark.
Police traced the call to a nearby payphone and rushed to the scene. But no one was there. Technicians thoroughly dusted the phone for any fingerprints the suspect may have left behind. None were found. A short while later, Abbotsford police dispatchers received a 911 call. During the conversation, which was recorded by police, a man identified himself as the killer. He wanted to know if police were having trouble finding him. He said he would never be so stupid as to leave his prints at the payphone.
Hey, where are you going to be?
He also promised to kill again.
Hello? Are you there?
It's not very often that a suspect starts phoning the police and threatening to attack again, threatening to do the same thing over again, and basically taunting that you're not going to be able to catch me, I'm going to do this again.
Desperate to stop this killer before he struck again, police turned back to Melissa Connor, the young woman who had survived the assault that had claimed the life of her best friend. Though her memory of the events had not fully recovered, she tried to describe the assailant to a sketch artist the best she could. She remembered the man as being a tall white male, balding, but with reddish-brown hair. The information was enough for police to formulate a composite sketch, which was quickly released through the media. The press dubbed him the Abbotsford Killer. A few days later, a woman came forward with information. She recognized the man in the sketch. He appeared to be the same man who had attacked her with a baseball bat several months before. When shown a photo lineup, she picked out a man named John Eller. For the first time in the murder investigation, authorities had a viable suspect. In November 1995, more than a month after Tracy Sawyer's murder, detectives arrested John Eller at his home. He vehemently denied being the Abbotsford Killer. After taking impressions of the suspect's teeth, forensic odontologist Dr. David Sweet compared them to the bite marks found on Tracy Sawyer's body. But investigators would be frustrated by the results of his analysis.
It became obvious very quickly that the spacing and the shapes of his teeth were much different than the teeth that would be necessary to cause this bite mark.
And DNA samples from the suspect did not match the DNA Dr. Sweet had extracted from the bite marks. John Eller was eventually cleared as a suspect in Tracy's murder. Soon after, the taunting phone calls from the Abbotsford Killer resumed. Frustrated, authorities came up with a plan. Convinced that someone somewhere knew the killer, they decided to release the recordings of the Abbotsford Killer's taunting phone calls made to police.
The general public were able to hear a large variety of voice characteristics of the individual who was calling us, and that was our goal. We also had that tape on a callback line at the police office, so anybody could call a designated number and just listen to the tape. They didn't have to talk to a police officer. They could just phone and listen to the tape over and over again.
The plan appeared to be a success. A woman who listened to the recordings came forward. She recognized the voice. Detectives played the tape for her again. She told them it sounded like a man named Terry Driver.
So you're positive that's your son?
She knew the voice, she said, because Terry Driver was her son. And she knew that he owned a police scanner and listened to it often at his home. Detectives quickly began checking Driver's background. Though he had no criminal record, the 32-year-old printer lived with his wife and 2 kids in the same neighborhood where the taunting phone calls had originated. Terry Driver was brought in for questioning. Though Driver adamantly denied being the Abbotsford killer, detectives collected hair and saliva for DNA analysis. Photographs and wax casts of Driver's teeth were also taken. At the Bureau of Legal Dentistry in Vancouver, Dr. Sweet looked for similarities between Driver's dental evidence and bite marks found on Tracy Sawyer's body.
I produced a clear overlay with the biting edges of his teeth recorded on it at life size, and then compared that to the photographs that were enlarged to life size also.
Dr. Sweet identified several unique characteristics in the suspect's bite that convinced him that Terry Driver's teeth were consistent with the bite marks on Tracy Sawyer's body.
He had some chipped teeth as well as some crowding or rotations of teeth so that they were out of position and not where you would normally find them. This made his teeth unique from everybody else's, and those features were recorded in the bite mark also.
But the irrefutable proof came from the DNA analysis. Terry Driver's DNA profile matched the profile of the DNA Dr. Sweet had extracted from the bite mark injuries. Dr. Sweet's double swabbing technique helped police clinch their case against a sadistic killer.
To answer any questions now without your lawyer present.
Terry Driver was arrested and charged with the murder of 16-year-old Tracy Sawyer and the attempted murder of her friend, Melissa Connor. Based on the evidence, Abbotsford police believed Terry Driver was a sick predator driven by an insatiable need for attention. On October 14, 1995, that craving exploded into violence. As Melissa Connor and Tracy Sawyer made their way to a nearby party, Driver attacked them without warning. After viciously raping and killing Tracy, Driver set out to taunt police and to prove that he was invincible. In October of 1997, Terry Driver was convicted of the sexual assault slaying of Tracy Sawyer and sentenced to life in prison. He received an additional 10 years for the attempted murder of Melissa Connor. Terry Driver was compelled to call attention to his crimes. But in Indiana, another murderer went to great lengths to conceal his guilt. On October 6, 1990, at 11:37 p.m., firefighters in Shelbyville, Indiana, responded to a blaze at a nearby apartment complex. The fire was coming from the bedroom of 42-year-old Shirley Sturgill, a tenant who lived on the second floor. After extinguishing the fire on the bed, one of the firefighters made a grisly discovery: the badly burned body of a woman. And the strong smell of lighter fluid led rescue workers to conclude that this fire was no accident. After extinguishing a blaze in an apartment in Shelbyville, Indiana, firefighters had uncovered the badly burned remains of a woman lying in a bed. And according to Chief Kurt Etherton of the Shelbyville Police Department, all indications suggested she had been the victim of a homicide.
It appeared a fire had been started either on or around the bed. There was an inverted V pattern, which is consistent with a fire where accelerants had been used. So it was our opinion that the fire had been set at that point.
After confirming that the victim was the tenant, 42-year-old Shirley Sturgill, evidence technicians began searching for clues to tell them who had started the deadly blaze and why. Several latent prints were located and preserved as evidence. But later analysis revealed they all belonged to the victim. Investigators also collected 2 different brands of cigarette butts. DNA analysis later revealed the presence of 2 distinct DNA profiles, and neither matched the victim. It appeared Shirley Sturgill's killer, or killers, had unsuccessfully tried to burn away any trace of evidence from the crime scene. At autopsy, the medical examiner determined that Shirley had not died as a result of the fire. She had been strangled to death. She had also been sexually assaulted. But the biological evidence recovered was too degraded for a thorough analysis. And there was more. Several marks were found on the victim's torso, stomach, and thigh. The ME concluded they were bite marks made from human teeth. For investigators, they were the strongest link to Shirley's killer.
That person told us that if we had a suspect, that they could take impressions and he would be able to determine whether or not those bite marks were made by a particular person, because there were some distinctive markings on the bites that would be consistent with someone's teeth not being aligned straight.
What time was it when
Detectives began their hunt for Shirley Sturgill's killer by speaking with her daughter. Angie Carr said she and her mother were very close. She couldn't think of anyone who would want to hurt her. She described her mother as a kind, sensitive, and selfless woman who dedicated her life to Angie's happiness and well-being. She was also a wonderful grandmother to Angie's young children. Angie had spoken to her mother on the phone just an hour or so before firefighters were called to the apartment. There didn't seem to be anything troubling her mother. The victim did mention during the conversation that her next-door neighbor, Jerry Donaldson, was there visiting at the time. It was a name already familiar to detectives. Arson investigators who had responded to Shirley's apartment the night of the murder said a neighbor was asking a lot of questions and seemed to know specific details of the crime itself. His name was Jerry Donaldson.
They said that the neighbor was telling several things about the crime that he felt no one else would probably know.
So when did you last...
Donaldson was brought in for questioning. He admitted visiting Shirley the night she died. She had hurt her back recently, and he checked in on her periodically to see if she needed anything. He said they watched TV, and about 10:30, after smoking a cigarette, he went home. When asked how he knew so much about the murder, Donaldson claimed he'd overheard the firefighters talking. He agreed to provide hair samples for a DNA analysis.
Where were you?
Donaldson's DNA was consistent with DNA recovered from one of the cigarette butts found in the victim's apartment. And though he had never denied being there, investigators were convinced he knew more about the murder than he claimed. On October 24th, nearly 3 weeks after Shirley Sturgill's murder, police arrested Jerry Donaldson on suspicion of murder. They also obtained a court order requiring impressions of his teeth to be made. A forensic odontologist overlaid impressions of the suspect's teeth over photographs of Shirley Sturgill's bite mark injuries. Though they didn't line up perfectly, the examiner felt that the two were consistent. But the suspect's lawyers saw to it that Donaldson would never stand trial for murder.
The defense team hired, I think, 2 different odontologists from other parts of the country who had differing opinions than the odontologists we used. The prosecutor and his staff sat down with the defense team and went over the discrepancies, which eventually led to the release of the suspect.
For Shelbyville detectives, the setback was frustrating. The investigation into Shirley Sturgill's savage murder had ground to a halt. Investigators were back to square one, and with no obvious suspects to pursue. Shelbyville, Indiana police struggled to solve the brutal homicide of 42-year-old Shirley Sturgill. Though teeth marks had been found on the victim's body, investigators had no other clues to the killer's identity. A year after the homicide, the case was turned over to Captain Bill Dwenger.
One of the things that struck me as odd, it was the amount of anger or rage that was built up inside someone that could inflict these type of injuries on another human being.
After re-examining dozens of witness statements taken over the previous year, Dwenger noticed that several people had commented that Shirley and her son-in-law had not gotten along. Though that didn't seem so unusual, investigators decided to talk with Shirley's daughter Angie again, and to her husband, John Del Carr.
Could I just get a copy of the... Mr. Carr, we're here investigating the...
John Del Carr was upfront about his feelings for his mother-in-law. He didn't like her, and they argued often. Mostly about Shirley's constant interfering with his marriage. He said that on the night of the murder, he was with an old Army buddy who was visiting from out of town. He hadn't seen Shirley that day. Angie corroborated her husband's alibi. Though John Del Carr was still considered a suspect, police had no evidence against him.
Okay, I think you need to get on that.
But a month later, detectives learned that John Del Carr had been arrested for murdering a young woman in nearby Hamilton County, Indiana. Though no bite marks were left on this victim, she had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. The same MO as the murder of Shirley Sturgill.
Yeah, I did the girl in Hamilton. That's what I'm in here.
Shelbyville detectives drove to the state prison to speak with John Del Carr and obtain potential evidence. But the suspect was uncooperative and refused to answer any questions. Investigators ultimately collected hair and blood samples for DNA comparisons with evidence recovered from Shirley's apartment. At the crime lab, examiners concluded that John Del Carr's DNA was consistent with DNA from one of the cigarette butts found in Shirley's bedroom. John Del Carr had been at the victim's apartment, something he previously denied. Though it was strong circumstantial evidence, it didn't prove that he was the killer. There was only one way investigators could make their case. They needed impressions of John Del Carr's teeth to compare to the bite marks found on Shirley Sturgill's body. But so far, they lacked probable cause to obtain a warrant to force the suspect to provide the samples. and they knew that without that evidence, it would be difficult to get a conviction.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We needed to know, and the jury's going to need to know, did we get his dental impressions? Did they match up to the bite marks on the body of Shirley Sturgill? Without that, I'm not sure a jury would be able to find him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So we needed that information, whether it was going to be, yes, they do match up, or no, they do not.
On August 3rd, 1994, almost 4 years after the murder, investigators finally got a break. Angie Carr had since divorced her husband, and now that he was in prison, she wanted to talk. She believed John Del Carr had in fact murdered her mother. She admitted to having lied to police before, but out of fear for her safety and the safety of her children. According to Angie, John came home very late the night of the murder. Suddenly, he grabbed a shotgun, pointed it at her, and told her he had hurt her mother.
You understand me? Come here. Come on. Come on. Get over here.
He dragged her to the room where her children were sleeping and threatened to kill her and them if she ever said anything. Angie told police that John kept up his threats in the following month.
The kids' room.
Besides hurting her back.
And she believed he wouldn't hesitate to carry them out.
Put a shotgun to their heads and threaten to kill them too.
John Carr's wife, I believe, was genuinely terrified of John. She knew what he was capable of. I think she did what she had to do to protect herself and her children.
It was the break detectives had been waiting for. Angie's testimony was enough for investigators to obtain a court order to force John Del Carr to give teeth impressions. Investigators contacted forensic odontologist Dr. John Kenny, the deputy coroner for DuPage County, Illinois.
I was asked to go to the state prison and to meet with Mr. Carr in the dental infirmary and to take his impressions and any other records as I would need to make a bite mark comparison.
Okay. But John Del Carr still refused to cooperate.
Okay.
Investigators received another court order, this time giving them the authority to anesthetize the suspect in order to obtain the evidence.
It was possible in this particular case to, because of the configuration of Mr. Carr's teeth, several of his teeth were misaligned and crowded, particularly on the upper arch, to take the model of his teeth and fit it right to the injury in one of these positive replicas.
All of the unique characteristics of John Del Carr's teeth matched the injuries present on Shirley Sturgill's body. There was no doubt that his teeth had left the wounds. Police believe that on October 6, 1990, John Del Carr, resentful of his mother-in-law's interference in his marriage, drove to her apartment and confronted her. His anger exploded into violence. Carr beat, bit, and sexually assaulted Shirley Sturgill before strangling her to death. After, he set her apartment on fire, hoping all traces of his crime would burn away. In April 1997, John Del Carr was convicted of the first-degree murder of his mother-in-law, Shirley Sturgill. He was sentenced to 60 years in prison. Some killers are driven to leave a very personal mark on their victims. When police have little other evidence to work with, they turn to forensic odontologists, who seize upon those marks to take the bite out of a killer's deadly smile. In Texas, an open field becomes a killer's makeshift burial ground. To find their suspect, investigators must first identify the victims from the tattered bones. A teenager looking for stray golf balls stumbles upon buried human remains. Scientists try to reconstruct the victim's face to help solve the mystery. A movie director goes missing in California. But before police can prove murder, they have to find the victim's body. Some killers choose to lay their victims to rest unceremoniously. Investigators must then rely on forensic examiners to uncover proof of murder and expose the killer's buried secrets. In July of 1994, the city of Austin, Texas was in the midst of a brutal summer heat. 20 miles outside of the city, in the small community of Round Rock, an off-duty officer spotted an abandoned vehicle parked off the main road. The officer ran the tag number and learned the car was registered to a woman named Sandra Dumont. But there was no sign of the owner. After noticing that one of the tires was flat, the officer decided to continue on, convinced the woman would eventually return for the disabled vehicle. A few weeks later, the same officer came across Sandra Dumont's name again. According to an article in the local paper, the young woman had been reported missing from her Austin home. The officer decided to return to the field where he had first come across Sandra's vehicle. The car had subsequently been towed. But the officer noticed a foul odor. He began searching the area. Nearby, hidden in some overgrowth, he found a woman's shoe. Then, a few feet away, the officer noticed an uneven sheet of plywood oddly placed in the middle of the pasture. When he lifted it up, he discovered the partial skeletal remains of a human body. The officer immediately called for assistance. Officers from the Round Rock Police Department responded to the scene. Police spread out and began scouring the field for any clues to tell them who this person was and how she had ended up here. A 100 yards away from where the skeletal remains were discovered, investigators found another human skull. Police feared they had stumbled upon a killer's makeshift cemetery. The team expanded their search of the field to cover the entire 110 acres. More bones were found scattered around the area. Police recovered several items of women's clothing. The garments appeared to have been cut with a sharp instrument. Police also collected a few menthol cigarette butts found near the remains. As the search for evidence continued, a young woman arrived at the scene, wanting to speak with detectives. She had been watching live media coverage of the search and feared that one of the victims was her missing friend, Sandra Dumont. She said the last time she spoke with her, Sandra was going out on a date with a man named Roger. The friend had never actually met Sandra's new boyfriend and wasn't sure of his last name. When Sandra went missing, the friend retrieved her address book. When she found it, it was open to the name of Roger Fain.
Looks like there's a name in it.
But until investigators could positively identify the victims, the information was of little value.
Let's go ahead and document this.
Using the dental records of known missing persons in the area, the medical examiner was able to establish both victims' identities. Sandra Dumont was one of them. The second victim was identified as Darlene Anderson, a 38-year-old Round Rock native who had been reported missing by her husband a month earlier. Both women appeared to be the victims of homicide. To determine how they died, forensic anthropologist Dr. Susanna Dana studied the bones.
You're looking for signs of trauma on the bones. You're looking for evidence of any kind of blunt force injury to the bones that would have produced fractures. You're looking for cuts in the bones that could be due to knives or a sharp instrument. You're looking for holes in the bones, especially the skull, which could be due to a gunshot wound.
Sandra Dumont's skull had such a wound. She had been shot at point-blank range by a .22 caliber weapon. Dr. Dana also found a fracture to Sandra Dumont's jawbone. And bloodstains on the mandible suggested that the victim had bled as a result of the injury. That meant the injury occurred prior to death.
It was consistent with a blow to the mandible, directly to the mandible by some blunt object, possibly a fist or a large stick or a large piece of wood, or like a bat can produce that kind of injury.
Looking for any trace of the killer that may have been left behind, forensic examiner Steve Robertson carefully scoured the clothing found near Sandra Dumont's remains. He found several tears and cuts. But the lack of blood found around the holes suggested that the garments had been cut from her body prior to her death. It appeared that Sandra Dumont had been tortured before being murdered. Detectives from the Round Rock Police Department feared they were dealing with a serial killer. Lieutenant Dan LeMay began looking into Sandra's background for clues to the killer's identity.
Sandra Dumont was 39 years old and living in the Austin area. She had a degree and was a very well-educated woman. She actually was employed as a blackjack dealer and was looking for better employment, attempting to better herself. From all accounts, she was a very nice person. Everybody liked her quite a bit.
Detectives traveled to the Austin club where Sandra was working the night before she disappeared. Co-workers said that Sandra had received a call during her shift that night. While on the phone, she seemed agitated and upset. The co-workers overheard her making plans to meet with someone. They believed it was her boyfriend, but they were not certain. When Sandra finished the conversation, she asked the manager if she could take off early. The manager agreed. He never heard from Sandra again. Police turned their attention to the name found in Sandra's address book. Investigators learned that Roger Eugene Fain had been a suspect in the disappearance of Darlene Anderson, the other victim unearthed at the pasture. Though police had been unable to tie him to her disappearance, something else now caught their attention. Roger Fain lived in a neighborhood just a short distance away from where the two bodies had been discovered. Police went to question the 41-year-old handyman. He claimed he didn't know anyone named Sandra Dumont, and he couldn't explain why his name was in her address book. Insisting he had nothing to hide, Fain gave detectives permission to search his truck. Investigators recovered cigarette butts and a few stray hairs from inside the cab. When asked about the injury to his arm, Fain stated he'd injured his wrist when the heavy lid of the large toolbox in the flatbed of his truck fell shut on it. But a rubber gasket, which lined the lid of the toolbox, made police suspicious of the story. Investigators forwarded what little evidence they had recovered to the crime lab. Trying to verify his statements, investigators contacted Fain's friends and associates.
Mr. Fain told several people that he'd injured his hand by dropping the lid of his truck toolbox on it. He also told at least one person, I believe, that he caught it in the hood of his truck. I seem to remember that he told one person he injured it at work, and it was some type of workman's comp claim. I think that the total numbers were something like 7 totally different stories to 9 different individuals on how he injured his hand.
The inconsistencies convinced the police that Fain was trying to hide something. Investigators hoped the hairs and cigarette butts recovered from Fain's truck would tell them what that was. Examiners at the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab compared samples of Sandra Dumont's hair to those found in Roger Fain's truck. They didn't match. The cigarette butts found in Fain's truck, however, were determined to be the same menthol brand as the butts recovered near the buried bodies. But the cigarette butts recovered from the pasture were too degraded for a more comprehensive DNA analysis. Investigators turned their attention to the injury on Fain's wrist, believing that was somehow the key to exposing his guilt. At a local hospital, they tracked down the suspect's x-rays.
But it's colored like a track.
Police learned he was treated for the break the day after Sandra Dumont disappeared. The x-rays were sent to forensic anthropologist Dr. Susanna Dana. After reviewing the evidence, Dr. Dana concluded that the fracture was consistent with what is called a boxer's break, an injury that results from pressure on the bone resulting from punching a hard object. Recalling that Sandra Dumont's jaw had been fractured, Dr. Dana looked to see if Fain's injury could have resulted from punching the victim.
In my opinion, it's very consistent with that injury to her mandible occurring from a closed fist, and he had a broken bone in his fist, occurring around the same time that this individual had disappeared.
Though circumstantial, the information was enough to allow investigators to obtain a warrant to search Fain's home. There, they recovered a leather pouch containing .22 caliber rounds, the same size as the bullet hole found in both victims' skulls. Police collected everything they could, including a roll of undeveloped film. Evidence technician Steve Robertson explains.
I collected it because we were hoping to find a photograph of the victim in this house, since he had denied knowing her.
The search team sent the undeveloped roll to the crime lab for processing. To their disappointment, the roll contained no photographs of Sandra. But then, examiners noticed something odd. 2 of the pictures were of the pasture where the victims' bodies had been recovered. Investigators noticed a dark mass in the middle of the photographs. On closer look, they realized it was the exact spot where Sandra Dumont's remains were lying. Like many other killers, Roger Fain had been compelled to keep a memento of his crime.
That was incredible. It was the first time that I really believed we would be able to get the conviction on that case.
Roger Fain was placed under arrest and charged with the murder of Sandra Dumont. Despite the overwhelming amount of evidence against him, he continued to maintain his innocence. Police believe that on July 24, 1994, Sandra left work early to meet with her new boyfriend, Roger Fain. But the killer had other plans. Fain lured Sandra to the pasture, where he beat and then shot her to death. He buried her remains and then calmly walked home, leaving Sandra's car in plain sight. On April 2, 1995, a Texas jury found Roger Eugene Fain guilty of the first-degree murder of Sandra Dumont. He was sentenced to life in prison. Police are still searching for evidence to connect Roger Fain to the murder of Darlene Anderson.
We'd like to ask that if anyone knows anything about that murder, that they contact us and they contact the Round Rock Police Department and pass that information on. We're concerned because of the type of offender that Mr. Fain is, that there may be other victims that we're unaware of. There may be other criminal behavior that we don't know about.
Though Roger Fain never told anyone about his crime, he betrayed himself with the lies he told and the photographs he took. But even when killers brag about a murder, police must still rely on solid physical evidence to win a conviction. On May 8, 1996, a teenager near Fort Worth, Texas, scoured the wooded areas of a golf course looking for stray balls. He noticed something unusual protruding from a dirt mound. As he approached, he realized it was the skeletal remains of a human hand. In Tarrant County, Texas, a teenager searching for stray golf balls had stumbled upon buried human remains. When investigators responded to the scene, it was clear they had unearthed a clandestine grave, one constructed to conceal a violent murder. The male victim had suffered massive trauma to the skull. Advanced decomposition made it difficult to discern any identifiable features. Technicians began scouring the dirt in and around the grave, searching for any clues to the man's identity. They recovered a metal cross necklace still draped around the victim's neck. But little else was found. Frustrated, investigators left the scene unsure who they had unearthed and why he had been murdered. With only bones to work with, medical examiners began searching for answers. In addition to the blunt force trauma to the skull, there were several nicks observed on the victim's ribs. This led the team to conclude that the male victim had been stabbed to death. Other than a red scorpion tattoo on the victim's shoulder, no identifying features remained. Examiners knew that determining when this victim died would be critically important in helping to establish his identity. Tarrant County Chief Deputy Medical Examiner Mark Krause looked to the victim himself for clues.
The deeper parts of the body were turned to adipocere, which is sort of a rancid soap-like material that takes, in this part of the world here in that time of year, takes a minimum of about 5 to 6 weeks to begin to accumulate to the degree we were seeing it.
Tarrant County Police released the few details they had on this John Doe to law enforcement agencies throughout Texas, hoping that the information would spark recognition from the public. the tactic appeared to work. Several people called in, hopeful their missing loved ones had been found. But in the end, none of the characteristics of the body found at the golf course matched details of known missing persons. According to Tarrant County Detective Mike Hargis, until police could give this victim a name, making a case for murder would be difficult.
It's very frustrating not to know who your victim is, because it doesn't really give you a starting point. Your starting point is usually their identity, so you can start tracing their background. We have to do a victimology, find out who your person is, what their risk level is, who they associate with, where they hang out at, things of that nature. And that can also tell you a lot about who might have been involved in their murder. And so it's very frustrating not to know where to start.
They turned back to forensic examiners for help. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Dana Austin was asked to create a biological profile of the victim. And though there wasn't much to work with, Dr. Austin can learn a lot about an individual by studying their skeletal structure. From the width of the brow ridge and other facial features, Dr. Austin concluded that the victim was a Caucasian male. Next, she needed to determine the victim's age.
In this case, in order to estimate the age, it was obvious that this person was not fully mature skeletally. There are gaps in between these bones that in an adult it would be completely fused.
Dr. Austin concluded the victim was between 17 and 21 years of age. To bring this victim to life, Dr. Austin next attached tissue depth markers to 21 different points on the skull. These markers reflect the average thickness of skin for people of similar race, age, and sex. After the skull was photographed from various positions, a forensic artist was brought in to create the contours of the victim's face. From that, a composite sketch was developed and then forwarded to Tarrant County investigators. Police released the sketch through the media. But again, nobody was able to identify John Doe number 87. Years passed without a break in the case. Chances that the mystery victim would ever find justice dwindled, and detectives began to believe that his killer may never be found. For 3 years, police in Tarrant County, Texas, struggled to solve the murder of a young man whose skeletal remains were found buried in a shallow grave. Though forensic examiners had given John Doe a face, his identity and the circumstances surrounding his death remained a mystery. Then, on December 3rd, 1999, police finally got a break. A woman in nearby Fort Worth came in to speak with police. She believed she knew the identity of the man found buried in nearby Tarrant County years earlier. She explained that around that time, she and her boyfriend, James Moore, were in the process of moving into a different apartment. While packing up their belongings, James and his best friend, Eric Tadana, began laughing after finding a newspaper article they had saved from a few months earlier. When the girlfriend asked what was so funny, the men showed her an article about a body found buried at a local golf course. They told her the unidentified victim was an acquaintance of theirs, a 20-year-old man named Patrick Zaka. Fort Worth police quickly forwarded the information to authorities at the Tarrant County Sheriff's Department. Homicide detective Mike Utley, assigned to the cold case squad, jumped on the lead. To verify the information, he began searching the database for a Patrick Zaka. Though no one with that first name was in the system, several other Zakas were listed. One, a man named David Zaka, turned out to be Patrick's father. Detectives believed they were closing in on John Doe number 87's identity.
10-4, I'll be en route to that father's location.
To find out, investigators drove to nearby Parker County to interview David Zaka about his son. Detective Mike Utley.
Once we located Patrick Zaka's father, we met with him at his home. And he described the Patrick Zaka that we thought we had as his son. It was indeed his son. He positively identified him.
What did he have to say?
Mr. Zaka explained that the relationship with his son had been a troubled one,
When was the last time you saw Patrick?
and he feared it had been irreparably damaged 3 years earlier.
I'm totally sick of you.
They had a bitter argument over Patrick's irresponsible behavior. Though he loved his son, David Zaka kicked Patrick out of the house and told him not to come back until he grew up. The last David heard, Patrick had gone to live with his mother in Alaska. He had not heard from his son since. To confirm the identity of John Doe number 87, forensic anthropologist Dr. Dana Austin compared known X-rays of Patrick Zaka to those taken from the murder victim. She found a perfect match. Investigators now shifted their focus to finding Patrick Zaka's killer. They began by questioning the witness who believed her boyfriend, James Moore, and his friend, Eric Tadana, had been involved in the murder. Though she was now reluctant to cooperate, investigators persisted. Finally, she explained that Moore, Tadana, and Zaka were members of a loosely organized gang known as the BLP. The gang dealt drugs, committed burglaries, and partied together. But according to the witness, Patrick soon fell out of favor with his peers.
And other crew members felt that Patrick Zaka was a little too preppy, too good looking, he dressed too nice. He just didn't really, they determined, didn't fit into their plans for their crew.
According to the witness, in the spring of 1996, James Moore and Eric Tadana decided to do away with him. One evening, the three went to the golf course to collect hallucinogenic mushrooms that grew nearby. They took a shovel as well as a baseball bat for protection. The girlfriend told detectives that Moore and Tadana returned a few hours later without Zaka. Though the information was incriminating, investigators realized that for the witnesses' statements to be useful, they needed to find a way to corroborate the story. In a local jail, detectives tracked down a former member of the BLP, currently serving time on a drug charge. He had information about Patrick's murder. He said that soon after Patrick disappeared, James Moore had shown him a baseball bat. On it were teeth impressions that Moore claimed were from the victim. Detective Mike Hargis.
James Moore would point out marks on the bat and say these are the marks that were caused by Skippy's teeth. And they all had referred to Patrick Zaka as Skippy. So he would show it to them and laugh about it and just generally brag about what he had done and how he'd done it.
The information provided investigators with enough probable cause to take James Moore and Eric Tadana into custody for suspicion of murder. Police also obtained warrants to search their homes. After placing James Moore in custody, police began searching his residence for proof of murder. They collected several baseball bats. Detectives were certain that one in particular was the murder weapon.
The reason I knew it was the same one because of the teeth marks about halfway down. That was important again because anytime we conduct an investigation, we're always looking for corroboration. We always look for the proof that what people say is actually so. And when we found the bat, that showed us that we were in the right place.
The evidence was forwarded to the crime lab for a closer look. A few miles away, police spotted Eric Tadana driving his vehicle. He was also taken into custody and transported to the Tarrant County Jail for questioning. While the suspects awaited interrogation, criminalists inspected the baseball bats. Forensic anthropologists positively identified the gouges on one of the bats as human teeth marks. Though they could not say with certainty that the marks had come from Patrick Zaka's teeth, the finding corroborated the inmate's testimony. Investigators had no doubt that they had Patrick Zaka's killers in their custody. When presented with the charges of murder and the evidence amassed against him, James Moore refused to make any statements. Instead, he requested the presence of his lawyer. But Eric Tadana was a different story. Fearing that his friend James Moore would accuse him of being the killer in order to avoid the death penalty, Tadana agreed to talk. He confessed to being a participant in the murder of Patrick Zaka. And he was willing to testify that it was all James Moore's idea. According to Tadana, he and Moore took Zaka to the golf course not to look for hallucinogenic mushrooms, but to kill him. When they were in a secluded area, Moore struck with a baseball bat, hitting Zaka several times in the head. Tadana joined in, stabbing Zaka repeatedly, finishing the kill. The killers then dug a shallow grave with the very shovel Zaka had carried. They buried their secret and left to go to a party. James Moore and Eric Tadana pled guilty to the murder of Patrick Zaka. James Moore was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Eric Tadana received 45 years. Moore and Tadana's crime had been discovered because they buried their victim in a shallow grave. In California, a more ambitious killer tried to permanently entomb his secret in concrete. On July 26, 1995, Ken Adamson entered the Indio, California Police Department to report his brother, Al Adamson, missing. He described his 66-year-old brother as an intelligent man. As a director of low-budget horror films dating back to the 1960s, Al Adamson enjoyed a cult celebrity status. After making movies for nearly 30 years, his career was starting to make a comeback. Home video releases of his earlier movies had sparked a new generation of fans worldwide.
Moore Cemetery is a cold.
As a result, he was now able to continue his passion for independent filmmaking.
In color, rated PG.
Detectives learned that Ken last spoke to his brother by telephone 6 weeks earlier. Al was having his house renovated, and he had discovered that the construction foreman, a man named Fred Fulford, had made over $4,000 in unnecessary purchases on his credit card. Ken told police that his brother was not happy. Indio detective Jack Anderson.
Mr. Adamson had planned to confront the person, Mr. Fred Fulford, the following day. And the brother was concerned for his welfare. He was not sure if there would be any violence involved, and he didn't really know this Fred Fulford very well.
Ken told the detective that he traveled to Indio the following day to check up on his brother. When he arrived, Fred Fulford answered the door. Al, he said, had just left. When Ken asked to use the bathroom, Fulford refused to let him in, saying he had just retiled that floor and it needed time to settle. Ken returned home and hadn't heard from his brother since. Though 6 weeks had passed since anyone had contact with Al Adamson, there was no evidence suggesting he had met with foul play. Still, Indio police agreed to look into the case. They went to Al Adamson's home to look around. There, they were met by a man who identified himself as the property caretaker. He said that Fred Fulford had hired him to watch the place while the renovations continued. Fulford, he explained, had left on a trip to Florida in Al Adamson's pickup truck a few weeks earlier. He hadn't seen Al in a while either, but believed the director was away scouting locations for an upcoming film. Detectives asked to look around the residence. The bedroom closet was mostly empty, and the lack of suitcases led the officers to speculate that Al Adamson had simply gone on a trip. Investigators examined the master bathroom that Fulford had prevented the director's brother from using 6 weeks earlier. The floor of the large room was covered with new tiles.
We were able to get permission to walk through the house and did not notice anything out of the ordinary. There was no unusual activity or signs of any struggle or anything like that.
Detectives began interviewing Adamson's neighbors. One nearby resident, a woman who cleaned Al Adamson's house, had information. She said that the day after Al Adamson was last seen, she saw Fred Fulford and some of the workers removing a jacuzzi from the master bathroom. She watched as they loaded it into a truck and carted it away. The following day, she noticed a cement truck parked in front of the residence. This was odd, she said, because the jacuzzi was one of Al Adamson's most prized possessions.
Mr. Adamson had really enjoyed this jacuzzi inside the residence, and he would use it almost on a year-round basis. Even though there was another one next to the pool outside, for some reason he seemed to prefer the indoor one. And this raised a lot of suspicions about why it would be taken out if, in fact, he did enjoy it that much.
Only Al Adamson and Fred Fulford knew the answers, and neither of them could be located. Weeks passed without a break in the investigation. Police were beginning to suspect that Al Adamson had not gone missing on purpose. But without a body, they had no way to prove that a crime had been committed. Police in Indio, California continued their search for cult movie director Al Adamson, reported missing 6 weeks earlier by his brother. Though investigators suspected that Fred Fulford, the man hired to renovate Adamson's house, was involved in the disappearance, they lacked proof that a crime had taken place. And Fred Fulford was nowhere to be found. While reviewing statements made by Adamson's cleaning woman, one peculiarity caught investigators' attention. Al Adamson had 2 jacuzzis in his residence, and the one that he used regularly, located in the master bathroom, had been removed by Fred Fulford the day after Adamson disappeared.
a jacuzzi that had been inside the residence had been removed, and subsequently the floor was filled in and tiled over. This raised our suspicion that he possibly was buried inside the residence.
Investigators obtained a search warrant for Al Adamson's home.
All right, we'll meet you out there in about 30 minutes.
Armed with picks and shovels, the team returned to the residence, looking to uncover proof of murder. They focused their efforts on the newly tiled bathroom floor.
As we were doing the excavation, we were stirring up a lot of dust and dirt, and there was about 10 of us crammed in this little 12-foot square room, along with our excavation equipment. Very miserable.
Normal foundations range from 4 to 6 inches in depth. Detectives found several feet of cement where the jacuzzi used to be. A layer of building material sat under that. By 8:30 the next morning, the team had been digging for 18 hours. 42 inches below the floor, they broke through a layer of dirt onto something soft. Someone had buried a comforter under the concrete. Wrapped inside, police found badly decomposed human remains.
As we removed the body from the excavation hole, we were able to determine that it was a male, probably in his mid-50s to 60, but we were not able to positively say that it was Mr. Adamson.
The remains were transported to the Riverside County Coroner's Office. Investigators needed to determine who they had found and how he had died before starting a homicide investigation. Examiners quickly noticed that the skull had suffered repeated massive blunt force trauma. This victim had been beaten to death.
Here, I wanted to show you this.
Deputy Coroner Paul Trujillo performed the autopsy.
Injuries were circular defects of approximately 1 3/4 inches of irregular edges, which would be consistent with being struck with something similar to this. Not necessarily this particular instrument, but something of this nature.
The body's state of decay put the time of death between 6 weeks and 2 months earlier. This matched the time frame during which Adamson disappeared. But investigators needed a positive identification. They had no DNA samples from Adamson to match to the body, and fingerprinting was impossible because of the advanced deterioration. This left only the use of dental records. Forensic odontologist Dr. Gordon Freeman was brought in to help. But there were no known dental x-rays of Al Adamson's teeth that could be used for comparisons. All investigators had found were written records made by Adamson's dentist a few years earlier. But fortunately, he had meticulously documented the condition of Adamson's teeth. Though it wasn't a lot to work with, Dr. Freeman began his comparisons.
The first thing we check for are the teeth present. The teeth might be been extracted, they may be present. If they are present, what we check for is dental fillings, whether they're silver dental fillings. They may have had done some crown work, whether gold crowns or porcelain crowns. In the case of the Adamson case, what we had to work with, we also had 2 removable partial dentures, both an upper and lower partial denture.
All of the unique features of Adamson's teeth noted in his charts matched those of the victim found buried under the tile floor. There was no doubt that Al Adamson had been found. Police believed that Fred Fulford was behind the macabre murder and burial. But with no weapon and only circumstantial evidence pointing to his guilt, investigators were a long way from proving murder. Human remains found buried beneath several feet of concrete in an Indio, California home were positively identified as missing film director Al Adamson. The 66-year-old had been murdered, and police believed that Fred Fulford, the man hired to do renovations at the director's home, was responsible. But with no physical evidence linking Fulford to the homicide, police struggled to make their case.
Step right here, that will give us a chance to
Investigators contacted the owner of the concrete company who had delivered cement to Adamson's home a few days after he disappeared. He positively identified a picture of Fred Fulford as the man who accepted the load. And he said Fulford paid with a check pre-signed by Al Adamson. He never saw Adamson himself.
Did you say?
The man explained that Fulford had ordered a full 4 yards of concrete to fill in a hole left by a jacuzzi that had been recently removed. The workers offered to help him wheel in the load, but Fulford declined. The man thought it was odd that Fulford insisted on wheeling all of the heavy concrete into the house by himself. But for police, it made perfect sense. Fulford was trying to keep everyone away from a crime scene. Though circumstantial, police believed that all of the evidence pointed to Fred Fulford as the killer. To find him, they tracked recent activity on the murder victim's credit card.
It's going to be a long process.
The charges were being made 3,000 miles away at a Florida motel.
A lot of that may have been due to the extreme heat.
A warrant was issued for the construction foreman's arrest.
But so far we've been
When Florida police spotted Fulford still driving Al Adamson's pickup truck, they moved in and placed him under arrest. Though he was dressed in the victim's clothes, he denied any knowledge of the murder. He was extradited to California, where he stood trial for the murder of Al Adamson. Police theorized that when Al Adamson confronted Fred Fulford over the excessive credit card purchases and threatened him with legal action, the contractor became enraged. Using a blunt instrument, likely one of the many hammers lying around the residence, he beat Adamson to death. To conceal his crime, he removed the jacuzzi from the master bathroom and buried his victim in its place. He filled in the grave with concrete, retiled the floor, and then left town, believing the eccentric director would not be missed. On March 3rd, 2000, Fred Fulford was sentenced to 25 years to life for first-degree murder. To cover their tracks, some killers choose to bury their victims in unmarked graves. But the dirt cannot always hide their crimes. With the help of forensic scientists, investigators can unearth the smallest of clues and uncover a killer's buried secrets. A deadly house fire in Boise, Idaho claims the lives of a father and his 2 young stepchildren. As investigators sift through the ashes for answers, they uncover evidence that the blaze was no accident. In Northern California, a man is reported missing, and all indications suggest a tragic accident is to blame. But a routine investigation soon exposes a web of deception, fraud, and possibly murder. When money is at stake, some predators will stop at nothing to exploit another's trust. But even the most complex schemes can't survive the scrutiny of those determined to find justice for victims who have been fatally betrayed. Nestled in the western foothills of the Rocky Mountains, Ada County, Idaho is home to the state capital of Boise. It is also home to some 400,000 residents who work, live, and play here.
This is the fire department.
In the pre-dawn hours of February 10th, 1992, emergency dispatchers received a 911 call. A man reported that his house, a two-story duplex, was on fire. And he believed a family of 4 who shared the house was still trapped inside. Within minutes, firefighters and emergency units from the surrounding area responded to the call. Fire and smoke consumed the duplex. Firefighters struggled to bring the first-floor blaze under control. Rescue workers fought their way through the flames and thick smoke to see if anyone had been trapped inside. In a second-floor bedroom, they discovered a man lying motionless on the bed. A young girl was found on the floor a few feet away. As the search continued, firefighters recovered the body of a young boy in a nearby bedroom. All of the victims were rushed outside for treatment. But despite the rescue workers' efforts, all 3 were pronounced dead at the scene. The man who lived in the separate residence inside the duplex told police that around 4 a.m. he was awakened by his smoke alarm. He tried to wake up the other family, but got no response. He identified the victims as 34-year-old Randy Rowe and his 2 stepchildren. He didn't know the whereabouts of the children's mother, Robin Rowe, who also lived at the residence. Then, 2 women arrived at the scene. One identified herself as Robin Rowe. Visibly shaken by the news, emergency workers escorted the young mother away from the house. Her friend, Joan McHugh, told police that Robin had fallen asleep at her house earlier that evening. Robin had awakened her just a short while earlier and wanted to return home. She had a premonition that something bad had happened to her family. All of the victims' bodies were removed from the scene and transported to the medical examiner's office for autopsy. Now, Fire Marshal Doug McGrew began looking for clues to tell him how and why the fire started.
We started looking into the ignition source of the fire by doing, like we do on all fires, we do an exterior walk around of the building, we look and see where the least damage is, we go there, and we start working towards the areas where the most damage occurred. Once we get into that area, then we start digging down through and layering through the debris and trying to determine exactly what ignited the fire.
Almost immediately, investigators made a strange discovery. The circuit breaker that controlled power to the family's smoke alarm was in the off position. But that did little to explain how the fire started. And because the damage was so extensive, finding those answers would take time. Within hours, autopsies were performed on Randy Rowe and the 2 children. The medical examiner found lethal amounts of soot and carbon monoxide in each of the victims' lungs and mucous membranes. He concluded that all 3 had died as a result of smoke inhalation caused by the fire. As the search for the fire's cause continued into the morning hours, arson investigators sifting through the ashes made a troubling find. On the carpet and in a charred pile of laundry, they discovered burn patterns suggesting a flammable liquid had been poured over the area. And the spot was just inches away from vents that circulate air throughout the residence. Investigators collected several pieces of the charred remains for further analysis. All indications were pointing to arson. And that suggested that the fire that had claimed the lives of the 2 young children and their stepfather had been intentionally set. To find out, State Fire Marshal Don Dillard delivered the charred samples collected from the house to the Idaho State Police Crime Lab, located in Pocatello. By comparing a burned sample believed to contain an accelerant to one that was untouched by the fire, he hoped criminologists could find answers.
What I've asked our criminologists to do is to compare the 2, what we feel the one to be evidence, and then the one that we feel probably doesn't have any kind of an accelerant on it, and she compares those 2, and by doing that, hopefully comes to the conclusion that there either is or isn't an accelerant involved in the case.
Forensic examiner Susan Williamson began testing the samples for the presence of an ignitable liquid. First, Williamson inserts a strip of charcoal ribbon in the sealed cans that contain the charred samples. Then, the can is placed in a chamber and heated for several hours. If any flammable substance is present, the heat will turn it into vapor, which will then be absorbed by the charcoal strip. Once the evidence has been heated, the charcoal strip is removed from the can. To transform any trapped vapors back into a liquid, solvents are then added to the strip. The resulting liquid is then subjected to sophisticated detection equipment that measures for the presence of known flammable substances. When the process was completed, Williamson analyzed the results.
One of the samples contained an ignitable liquid. And in this case, I identified a heavy petroleum distillate. And heavy petroleum distillates include things like kerosene, number 2 and number 1 diesel fuel, and fuel, heating fuel oil, and so forth.
The analysis had exposed the deadly fire as an act of arson. And more disturbing, it had exposed a triple homicide. Forensic examiners had exposed a house fire in Ada County, Idaho, that had claimed 3 lives as a triple murder. The findings were passed on to homicide investigators. Looking for answers, detectives turned to Robin Rowe, the wife and mother of the 3 victims. When asked why she wasn't at the residence on the night of the fire, Robin explained she had been staying at her friend's house. Over the past few months, her marriage had been falling apart.
Well, that was the strange thing.
In fact, Robin believed that her husband Randy might have intentionally set the deadly fire. She said that recently, Randy had become increasingly abusive toward her. The smallest things would set him off, and he couldn't seem to control his anger, even in front of the children. Robin claimed that on one occasion, Randy had struck her so hard she was forced to go to the hospital. Several hours before the fire, Randy had called her at her friend's house and demanded that she come home. When she refused, he threatened that she would never see him or her children again. Though it appeared Randy Rowe had made good on his threats, the story troubled veteran detective Gary Rainey.
Any parent is protective over their children, and had he been this abusive parent, any reasonable spouse would have wanted to remove the kids from that situation. Her story was that he was only abusive with her and not with the kids. That's not the norm, and certainly in law enforcement we recognize that that abusive personality, that violent personality, the anger control problems, is not going to just be focused on one particular person, especially with those pre-teen age kids who sometimes anger parents pretty easily.
With their suspicions raised, police wanted to learn more about the Rose marriage and corroborate Robin's alibi. They began with Joan McHugh, the woman who had been with Robin at the time of the fire.
Well, there was some abuse problems.
Because of Randy's abuse, Robin, she said, had been staying with her. That night, Robin had fallen asleep on her couch around 11 p.m.
And then,
Joan went to bed a short while later and never heard anything to suggest Robin ever left the apartment. Joan had no doubt that Robin was a victim of domestic violence.
And she said that it had been going on for quite a while, but she had never said anything to anyone. And it just seemed to escalate over a period of, I don't know, about 4 or 5 weeks. And a few times she came here, 10 or 11 o'clock with the children, because they were escaping from Randy.
The information gave Robin Rowe a solid alibi for the time of the 3 deaths. And the result of the forensic analysis had made it plausible that Randy Rowe had in fact killed himself and his 2 stepchildren in a vengeful act of rage. But that theory would not go unchallenged.
I learned that there had been some domestic violence going on. But then as a couple other people called, and I learned that there wasn't domestic violence going on according to them. And so it just started not adding up very well.
To learn more, police brought in Randy Rowe's sister to answer questions.
Any signs that Robin or the kids were the victims of any kind of violence, any bruises by anybody?
She didn't believe that Robin was the victim of domestic violence, as she had portrayed herself to be.
Ever any discussion?
Though Randy and Robin had begun to fight more and more, he was not a violent person. The kids were Randy's life. His sister knew that he never would have harmed them. And according to the sister, Robin treated Randy as little more than her kid's babysitter. As a result, Randy talked openly about the possibility of divorce. But he loved the children as if they were his own. And the kids made it clear that they didn't want Randy to go.
The children had, at one time, reportedly told Robin that they wanted to stay with Randy and not go with her. And of course, they were Robin's natural children and not Randy's.
To resolve all of the conflicting information about the couple, investigators decided to take a closer look into Robin Rowe's background. What they found was shocking. According to records, Robin had tragically lost a son nearly 15 years earlier. Her 6-year-old boy had died in a suspicious fire at her California home. Arson investigators were never able to determine a cause of the fire. But for Idaho police, the similarities between the tragedies had to be more than coincidental. Robin Rowe was now emerging as the prime suspect in the deaths of her husband and 2 children. But with an airtight alibi and no obvious motive to explain such an unthinkable crime, police knew that proving it would not be easy. Police in Ada County, Idaho, struggled to find answers in a deadly house fire that had claimed 3 lives. Robin Rowe, the wife and mother of the victims, had an airtight alibi for the night of the murders. But all of the evidence was pointing to her as the prime suspect. What investigators needed was proof. Looking for potential clues, they began reviewing statements made by Robin's friends and family.
Husband's kids.
They found that one friend had stated that a few days prior to the fire, Robin had mentioned that she had rented a storage unit and had taken some of her belongings there. The timing of the rental was too close to the murders for police to ignore. Detective Gary Rainey followed up on the lead. Soon, he was able to locate the unit that Robin had rented. With a warrant in hand, investigators were dispatched to the storage unit. There, they found boxes of personal papers belonging to Robin. Among the items was an envelope filled with several $100s in cash and bingo receipts from the YWCA where Robin Rowe worked. Police also collected several life insurance policies taken out on Robin Rowe's husband and her 2 children. Robin was listed as the sole beneficiary on all of the policies, and she stood to gain more than $275,000 from the 3 deaths. It was powerful circumstantial evidence of murder.
One of the most disturbing facts being that she took out the last 2 policies. She already had multiple policies, but Robin took out the last 2 policies on the children January 24th, and the fire was February 10th.
Still, it wasn't enough to take Robin Rowe into custody. Police began interviewing Robin's co-workers at the YWCA. The manager was surprised to learn that cash and receipts had been found in the storage facility. Robin had reported that proceeds from the Y's last bingo game had been destroyed in the house fire that killed her family. Though authorities lacked hard physical evidence of murder, they now had proof of embezzlement. The prime suspect in the triple homicide investigation was placed under arrest and charged with grand theft. But police were a long way from proving that Robin Rowe was a cold-blooded killer. Hoping to generate a lead that could destroy her alibi, details of the crime were released through the media. A short while later, police got a tip. A local newspaper delivery man called and told police that he remembered something unusual on the night of the fire. He said that while making deliveries around 4 a.m. that morning, he saw a car driving away from the duplex. He wasn't sure of the make of the car, but he described it as a late model 4-door with rectangular taillights. Detective Ken Smith asked the delivery man to come down to the station.
We had, prior to his arrival at the sheriff's office, had arranged to have vehicles similar to Robin Rowe's vehicle in the back lot, and Robin Rowe's vehicle was in the back lot. We walked him into the lot and asked him to look for vehicles that or look and see if there were any vehicles that matched the description of the vehicle that he had seen in the subdivision on the morning of the fire. When he observed Robin Rowe's vehicle, he immediately pointed to that vehicle and stated that it was the same body style, same color, and resembled the car that he had seen.
You sure? Definitely.
The witness had placed a car similar to Robin Rowe's near the crime scene just a short while before fire consumed the duplex. Detectives still had to overcome a major obstacle. Robin's friend, Joan McHugh, had provided her with a solid alibi for the time of the homicides. Though police didn't think Joan was lying, they theorized that Robin had managed to slip out of the apartment undetected. Detective Gary Rainey was determined to find out.
I devised a scenario to try to prove or disprove Robin's presence in the apartment, and that was to have Joan confront Robin with the idea that she got up in the middle of the night, 3:30 in the morning, which was the time that we knew about when the fire started, that Joan would tell Robin that she came downstairs to get a drink of water and Robin wasn't there.
When contacted, Joan McHugh agreed that the next time Robin called her from prison, she would tell her the false story and record the conversation. Joan was only too happy to cooperate.
I'm sure, I really shouldn't speak for Detective Rainey, but I'm sure that he believed that somewhere in the phone calls she would absolutely destroy all of her alibis. And I just knew that she was going to explain everything and he was going to feel like a fool because she was innocent. There is no way a mother kills her children. And so I agreed to tape the phone calls.
On the evening of February 20th, Robin called Joan from prison.
Yes, Robin. There's something that I have to talk to you about. That morning, I came downstairs and you weren't here, Robin. Where were you?
Yeah, I know. I went outside.
It wasn't the answer she expected. Robin repeated her story that at around 3:30 a.m., she was awakened by a strange premonition that something bad had happened to her family. But now, she added that she then contacted a psychiatrist and left the apartment to speak with her for over an hour. On tape, Robin had destroyed her alibi. Joan McHugh was devastated.
It was terrible. And I didn't know what to do after. It was on a tape recording. And it was like, you know, do I call Gary or do I just take this thing and throw it in the trash and no one will ever know? But I would have known. And it probably sounds dramatic, but Randy and the children deserve better than that. So I called Gary.
Police finally had enough evidence to charge Robin Rowe with 3 counts of first-degree murder. Based on the evidence, detectives believe that in the early morning hours of February 10th, Robin Rowe slipped out of her friend's house and returned to her own home. She turned off power to the smoke alarm. Then, driven by a twisted desire to cash in on her family's life insurance policies, she placed a pile of laundry near the air vents and set the deadly blaze. After murdering her husband and 2 children, Robin calmly returned to Joan McHugh's house to establish her alibi.
Psychological experts have described to me that it's simply a balance in her mind of what she personally is better off with, a husband and 2 children, or the proceeds of life insurance policies and the opportunity to move to a new state, and that she simply weighed those 2 things and decided that the money and the new life was what she wanted today.
Robin Rowe was convicted of arson and 3 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of her husband, Randy, and her 2 children. She was sentenced to death. Idaho police had to reconcile conflicting information to find the truth. In California, detectives must follow a complex maze in order to expose a murder. Known for its temperate climate and lush farmland, Yolo County, California offers a quiet rural lifestyle, miles outside the state capital of Sacramento. But residents there are no strangers to tragedy. On the morning of February 5th, 1997, 911 dispatchers at the Yolo County Sheriff's Department received a call from a concerned mother.
Do you have a responsible on that?
She feared that her son was missing. Deputies responded to the home. Patty Howard told the officer that she hadn't seen or heard from her 18-year-old son, Nick, since the previous evening. Patty said that the night before, Nick had helped her close up the auto body shop that the Howard family owned. As they were leaving, Nick said he had to retrieve a wallet he had left behind at a nearby restaurant. He told his mother he would be home in a couple of hours and said goodbye. But around midnight, Nick called and left a message on the answering machine. He said he was having car problems and was running late. But he never made it home that night. The family was very close, and it was completely out of character for Nick not to call and check in. Missing teenagers often turn up within a few days. But for Yolo County Detective Larry Cecchetini, Nick Howard didn't seem to fit the profile of a typical runaway.
This is probably one of the closest knit families that I've ever seen. They just, from all indications, they were a very close, very loving family. For Nick to call and not come home was just something that had never happened before.
Investigators feared the teenager's car troubles had led to an accident. Police, friends, and family retraced his usual route. But after 2 days, the search had turned up nothing. Then, 2 men out on the search flagged down a patrol car near the banks of the Sacramento River. They had discovered tire tracks that led from the shoulder of the road down toward the riverbank.
Right down up here? Right over here. Why do you think these are Nick's?
Figured nobody else would be laying those tracks down there. I don't know.
One of the men, 42-year-old Ralph Marcus, said he was a close friend of the Howard family.
Charles 22, I think we have a 972 that went over the cliff. If you could start dart.
10-4.
Ralph said that he and his associate, Jake Stanton, were out looking for Nick when they came upon the tracks. Unsure if the discovery was related to Nick's disappearance, Detective Cecchetini was contacted. He knew that stretch of highway well, and the news was not encouraging.
That's what I was thinking. This strip of roadway is a winding strip of river road. There are no guardrails on our county side. Quite frequently, inattentive or sleepy drivers do go into the river.
Search and rescue units from the Yolo County Sheriff's Department and officers from the California Highway Patrol responded to the scene. The team followed the tracks down an embankment. They led to the water's edge and then disappeared into the river. Members of the Yolo County Boat Patrol and rescue divers began scouring the river. After several hours of searching, divers signaled they had found something. 16 feet below the surface, they had discovered a vehicle resting on the riverbed. A tow truck pulled the car from the muddy river. The vehicle matched the description of the one driven by Nick Howard. A wallet recovered from the passenger seat contained the driver's license of the missing teenager. Examiners began searching the vehicle for clues. On the floorboard, they found Nick's prescription eyeglasses. They were bent, as if his head had violently impacted the dashboard or the steering wheel. Then, police noticed that a film of oil coated the vehicle's interior. It appeared to have come from an opened container of motor oil located in the back seat. The vehicle was towed to a police impound lot for a more thorough examination. Officers and divers from the boat patrol continued searching the area for any signs of Nick Howard. But there was no trace of the teenager. And if he was unconscious and not wearing his seatbelt when he went into the river, the powerful currents had likely carried his body miles away. With so many unanswered questions, police looked for clues to explain the accident. But aside from the tire tracks at the side of the road, little else was found.
Usually if the vehicle went into the water at a high rate of speed, you're going to have a lot of broken rocks, you're going to have debris, possibly some skid marks, some significant physical evidence.
As the investigation continued, detectives received some unexpected information. Nick Howard's family had handed over some papers they found while going through his room. One was a life insurance policy in the teenager's name that was worth $850,000. There was also an uncompleted change of beneficiary form that listed Ralph Marcus, the man who had discovered the tire tracks at the river, as the new beneficiary. Police were surprised that someone as young as Nick Howard would have such a large insurance policy.
Essentially, he was spending a quarter of his monthly income on a life insurance policy, which struck us as odd. It's not something that, life insurance just isn't something that an 18-year-old thinks about, especially when it costs that amount of money. Why don't you have a seat right there?
And that wasn't the only troubling news. An acquaintance of Nick Howard's came forward with information.
Tell me about Nick's life insurance.
He believed that Nick was alive and well. Recently, he said, the teenager had boasted that his life insurance policy would make him a millionaire.
He had this big policy.
All he had to do was fake his own death, disappear, and then have Ralph Marcus collect on the policy. A polygraph test later confirmed he was telling the truth. The frantic search for a missing teenager had taken an unexpected turn. Now, investigators had to consider that Nick Howard had staged the auto accident and his own disappearance. To find out, police enlisted the aid of the California Highway Patrol's Accident Reconstruction Unit. Using the tire tracks found by the side of the road as his guide, investigator Steve Walker surveyed the scene. Detailed measurements indicated that the car had left the road at a 45-degree angle, and there was no evidence of vaulting or bouncing onto the shoulder. That suggested the car was traveling no faster than 14 miles per hour when it left the road. It was unlikely that a sleeping or inattentive driver had caused the vehicle to end up in the river. And there was no evidence suggesting that a collision had taken place.
There was no debris, there were no fluids, stains on the roadway. There was nothing that you typically see in a traffic collision. It was very, very anomalous. And it likewise fit the idea that the car had not departed from the roadway in a violent manner, that it was set up to leave the roadway in a more controlled manner.
Police next examined the engine of Nick Howard's car, looking for any mechanical problems that could explain the accident. Almost immediately, they found a clue. A plastic bottle cap had been intentionally wedged into the engine's throttle, holding it open. And the cap had originated from the opened container of motor oil recovered from the vehicle's interior. With their suspicions raised, police turned to auto expert Charles Radford of the California Highway Patrol. To determine the significance of the findings, he conducted an experiment. He wedged the cap into the throttle of a car with a similar manual transmission engine. He put the car in gear and then turned on the ignition. The engine revved up to 6,000 RPMs and then lurched forward.
And we could get speeds in second of as high as 20 miles an hour, and in fourth gear it was approximately 15 miles an hour within a 100 to 150 foot range. What this shows is that it would be very easy for someone to be able to take a car and put it in the river by use of an oil bottle cap.
All of the evidence police had gathered now led them to believe that 18-year-old Nick Howard had in fact staged his own disappearance. And now he was wanted for questioning in the elaborate insurance fraud scheme. But so far, all efforts to locate the teenager had turned up nothing. Police in Yolo County, California continued their search for 18-year-old Nick Howard. While looking for answers, they uncovered evidence suggesting the teenager and his friend, Ralph Marcus, had staged the disappearance. It appeared to be an elaborate scam to collect on a life insurance policy worth $850,000. But with Nick Howard's whereabouts uncertain, police turned their focus to Ralph Marcus, the beneficiary of the insurance policy. A background check on the 42-year-old heightened Detective Larry Cecchettini's suspicions that the disappearance was in fact a hoax and that Ralph Marcus was somehow involved.
Ralph Marcus had done thefts, identity scams, insurance fraud, bankruptcy fraud. He was a drug runner.
Under questioning, Ralph Marcus denied any involvement in Nick's disappearance. And he knew nothing about any insurance scams.
Tell me about your relationship with Nick.
Ralph said he had been a friend of the Howard family for years. Nick was like a godson to him. He was shocked to learn that he was the beneficiary of Nick's life insurance policy. Ralph said he wasn't interested in the money. Police sensed he was lying. But with no hard evidence, they had no choice but to release him. The investigation was going nowhere. Then, on February 25th, 1997, 3 weeks after Nick Howard disappeared, Yolo County Police got a break. But it wasn't one they had expected. A man fishing on the Sacramento River had called police after discovering human remains. Less than a mile from where Nick Howard's car was found, police recovered the partially decomposed remains of a young man. The victim, found with a single glove on his right hand, matched the description of the missing teenager. And dental records later confirmed that Nick Howard had finally been found. With no obvious cause of death, the body was transported to the Yolo County Coroner's Office. There, forensic pathologist Dr. Brian Peterson began looking for answers.
Here's some pictures of the body, how we found them on scene.
A close examination of the glove and the clothing indicated that no traces of motor oil were present. And that suggested the victim was not in his car when it went into the water. For Detective Cecchetini, the findings didn't make sense.
A couple of things just didn't add up. For one, the body was wearing one glove, which we thought was somewhat unusual. I remembered that the car was coated with motor oil when we initially located it, but yet there were no traces of motor oil on the clothing. Granted, he'd been in the water for some time, but the traces of motor oil are not going to be entirely washed from the body.
Dr. Peterson next looked to establish a cause of death. Fluid found in the victim's lung suggested Nick Howard had drowned. But there was also something else.
Additionally, there were changes consistent with manual strangulation, bleeding inside the muscles of the neck.
Nick Howard had been murdered. For the Howard family and for investigators, the discovery was devastating. In addition to the tragic loss, it was now clear that Nick Howard had not staged his own disappearance. And Ralph Marcus was now the prime suspect in his death.
Now we have a body. We've pretty much determined that the body was not in the car when it went in. We have an $850,000 potential life insurance payout, and we have the beneficiary, and we're doing everything that we can to make sure that we get to the bottom line on this and get to the truth of what happened.
Police contacted the insurance agent in nearby Sacramento who handled Nick's policy. According to records, Nick came in a few weeks before he disappeared requesting that Ralph Marcus be named the new beneficiary. But he didn't have all of the correct paperwork, and the change was not completed. But Nick didn't seem to understand, and the agent believed that he left that day convinced that his policy had in fact been updated.
In the insurance agent's opinion, when Nick left, he was under the impression that the change was completed and that Ralph Marcus was the beneficiary.
Though incriminating, the information fell short of the smoking gun investigators would need to prove murder. Then they got a break. A witness asked Detective Cecchetini to meet him at a pier on the Sacramento River. Jake Stanton, the man who was with Ralph Marcus when the tire tracks were discovered at the river, believed he had important information about the case. Jake said that shortly after Nick went missing, Ralph had asked for his help in searching for the teenager. While driving along the Sacramento River, Ralph pulled up to the pier. He said it was one of Nick's favorite spots. As they searched the area, Jake saw Ralph Marcus walk to the end of the pier toward a black glove.
As Jake turns around, he sees Ralph ditch the glove off the top of the pier. Before Jake even says anything, Ralph mentions to him, "I was trying to get the glove."
Detectives showed Jake the black glove recovered from Nick Howard's body.
You ever see anything that looks like this?
He was certain it was identical to the one Marcus had kicked off the pier.
Jake was adamant about the fact that Ralph was trying to kick the glove off so that it could not be recovered. The significance of this is that we had never told anybody that when Nick was found, he was wearing one glove.
The information brought police one step closer to proving that Ralph Marcus had murdered 18-year-old Nick Howard. But so far, all of the evidence was circumstantial. Police in Yolo County, California were now certain that 18-year-old Nick Howard had been murdered for his life insurance policy, worth $850,000. All of the evidence suggested that Ralph Marcus, the beneficiary of the policy, was responsible. The suspect was brought in for another interview. Police showed him the black glove that had been recovered from the victim. Though witnesses saw Marcus kick an identical glove into the Sacramento River, he claimed he hadn't seen one like it before. Marcus continued to insist that he had no knowledge of Nick's life insurance policy and was in no way involved in his death. He pointed to the fact that he had gone to great lengths to help find Nick after he disappeared. But detectives believe that Ralph Marcus had only done that in order to divert attention from himself.
Thank you very much.
Authorities obtained a warrant to search the home Ralph Marcus shared with his mother. There, they found several documents relating to Nicholas Howard's insurance policy. And Marcus was in the process of filing a claim for the $850,000. The suspect was well aware of Nick's life insurance policy, something he had repeatedly denied. He was placed under arrest and charged with first-degree murder. Police believe that Ralph Marcus was able to get 18-year-old Nick Howard to agree to stage his own death after making him the beneficiary of his life insurance policy. But Marcus never intended to split up the money. Once the plan was in place, he beat and strangled the teenager, then tossed him into the river to die. After placing the teenager's wallet and glasses inside the vehicle, Marcus rigged the engine of Nick's car with an oil cap and sent the vehicle into the water, hoping his death would appear as an accident. Ralph Marcus was convicted of the first-degree murder of Nicholas Howard and sentenced to life in prison. Greed and self-interest can be strong motivations for murder. And when the killer is cunning, the truth can be elusive. But detectives and forensic scientists are dedicated to finding justice for unsuspecting victims who have found themselves betrayed.